This is how you cross over from Israel to Gaza, and right now we're in no man's land. Prime Minister, do you now regret when once asked what your favourite joke was, you replied Nick Clegg? And Deputy Prime Minister, what do you think of that?
Mr. Trump, why should you be president? What makes you fit for the role? Is it just one big ego trip?
Thank you very much.
People aren't sure they can trust what you say. You say things and then it turns out that they're not quite what you said.
And if we deliver what we say we're going to deliver.
My name's Andy Bell and I've been a journalist for over 30 years. In this podcast series, How Did We Get Here?, I try to provide context and background to a big story in the news by talking to someone with real insight. Today there seems to be an avalanche of questions about honesty in public life, whether it's former Prime Ministers lobbying or current Prime Ministers paying for their flats. Is this just the inevitable messiness when money collides with power and public service? Or can we call it corruption? And what can we do about it? I've been talking to Dr. Hannah White, Deputy Director of the Institute for Government and formerly head of the Committee on Standards in Public Life. I began by asking her if, after what we've seen in the last few weeks, this is getting worse.
I think the situation we find ourselves in is quite unusual for two reasons. One, because we are talking about scandals which touch on the behaviour of prime ministers. So firstly David Cameron and now Boris Johnson. Also because of the breadth of the allegations that we're seeing. So the allegations in relation to the two of them, but also other people in government who may have done sort of something inappropriate in relation to Greensill. It stretches to civil servants as well as to prime ministers and other ministers. So I think that the reason that people are feeling concerned is this really seems to have breadth and depth and to go to the top of the tree, as it were. And that is alarming that we're discovering that, certain things have happened. There hasn't been transparency, and in lots of these cases, the issue may simply be about transparency, that nothing's actually been done that's been against the rules, but things should have been declared. So I think that's why it feels unusual at the moment.
So you approached this with a lot of experience in this area. You were head of the Committee on Standards in Public Life. Remind us why that even had to come into being and what it's supposed to do.
So that was set up about 25 years ago now by John Major, and that was in the wake of the Cash for Questions scandals that rocked his government. And that was really the start of the setting up of the sort of apparatus that we now have in Britain for managing public standards in public life. And the first thing that the Committee on Standards in Public Life did under the chairmanship of someone called Lord Nolan was come up with 7 principles according to which they felt people who are in public life ought to behave. And those are selflessness, integrity, objectivity, accountability, openness, honesty and leadership. And those are now the bedrock of loads and loads of codes of conduct that people in public life are supposed to follow. So they underpin the ministerial code, the civil service code of conduct, the code of conduct for MPs. Alongside those sort of principles, we have a whole set of regulators and people who are supposed to enforce rules and some laws, but it's a real patchwork. That's the problem with it. There's lots of areas which have been regulated and covered, normally because there's been a scandal in a particular area, but then there are gaps between them. And I think what we've seen lately is lots of instances of things which seem to fall between these different apparatus that we've set up.
I want to come back to that sort of patchwork as you've described it. But before the Committee on Standards in Public Life, that was only in the 90s. I mean, before that, were people just supposed to just do the right thing? Is that how it worked?
Before that, there was certainly more just of an assumption that, everybody in government was a good chap, and, they were more likely to be chaps at that point, and that they would do the right thing. It didn't mean that there weren't scandals before that, but there weren't these sort of external, independent, more or less independent bodies that had been set up to try to stop things happening and to be able to potentially sanction people if things went wrong. And I think that's the key thing, that we're now got more into a situation where potentially if you do something wrong, something could happen to you. And it's felt over time that in different areas that's been needed, because there have been, we've seen the MP's expenses scandal, which followed on from Cash for Questions. We've seen, other situations where actually people feel it's not enough to rely on people to behave in the way we would all hope that they would.
You mentioned the patchwork, and I must say, looking at it, it does feel like that. I mean, we talked about your committee that you were on the Committee on Standards in Public Life, But we've now got the Electoral Commission looking into the flat. We've got the Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards. We've got an independent advisor on ministerial standards who's just been appointed. I mean, there's ACOBA, which is this body that was meant to check whether ministers moving out into the private sector were allowed to do it or not. I mean, it's partly my job to keep across these things, and I'm bewildered by all of it. I mean, what is going on with this sort of collection of agencies?
Well, I often think that the ethical standards landscape is like a microcosm of the British Constitution, in that it's evolved over time and it's responded to different events and it has adapted, and no one's ever sat down in one go and said, right, what do we want all the rules and principles to be that cover all the different areas? It's just been, nobody's ever had the energy and the real political will to do that. All they've ever had is enough to deal with whatever scandal happened last. So as I said, we had the MP's expenses scandal. That led to the setting up of something called IPSA, which now both administers MPs' expenses, but also, checks that they're doing the right thing. We had the sort of lobbying scandals, which led to the setting up in 2013 of a very toothless regulator, really. And it was just a sort of political patch, really, to be able to say we're doing something, but not really to sort of think from first principles. How do we cover all this and make sure that everybody knows what rules they're supposed to be following? Because I think we have seen instances where genuinely people feel that they just weren't aware, and maybe that's being too kind. We ought to, if you're in that sort of position, you ought to make very sure that you are aware. But sometimes I think people feel that the rules are complex, and so complex that they haven't been able to follow them.
Is there an example of one of those organisations and bodies that you think, that's the one that's working? Maybe that could be a model for the others. Is it from recent experience, or are they all just kind of muddling along, if I can put it like that?
Well, I think IPSA, which I mentioned, is quite a good example. And I mean, it's almost that you were able to set up a really quite a strong body in the form of IPSA because the MP's expenses scandal was so bad. MPs had such a detrimental effect on public trust. MPs really felt they had to do something. So you've got a body which is independent, gets to set the rules and gets to enforce the rules, and it also has sort of criminal sanctions. And I think the mark of the fact that IPSA is working is just that we don't get stories now in the papers about MPs' expenses. So that almost is, you almost don't want to hear about these bodies, and that's how you know when they're working.
Is there a case for trying to bring everything together under one great big umbrella? I'm thinking of something like, Ofcom that regulates the whole of broadcasting, and Ofwat that regulates the whole of the sort of water industry. Is there something to be said for, there's going to be one body that basically oversees standards in public life? Do you think that could work?
Well, that's what the Canadians do. They have a sort of overarching commission which covers much more. I think that would be desirable, but I really can't see it happening because the political will which would be required, and it's not just about, wanting to solve this once and for all, which you'd think that lots of people would sign up to, but it's also about the sort of different considerations in terms of who should be able to investigate and sanction a minister, who should be able to investigate and sanction an MP, and who needs to be involved in sort of signing off on any of that. There are some sort of constitutional issues which are tricky, not insurmountable, I would suggest, but I just don't see there being the political will to do it, which is a shame because I think, lots of these things could go away if the rules were clearer and more comprehensive so that everybody knew what they were required to do.
And again, if this is going to be left to the individual bodies, and it sounds like you feel that's probably the way it's going to end up, have they got the sanctions that they need? I was just reading this morning, the Electoral Commission, for instance, which is now investigating if anything went on with the refurbishment of the flat in number 11 in Downing Street. I read that the maximum sanction they can bring is a fine of £20,000, which seems not a great deal. I mean, there must be more that can be done, and presumably the police can be brought in at certain points.
That's right. So in relation to the Electoral Commission, they can fine up to £20,000. That's if they think that something happened, through inadvertence, that people, as I was saying earlier, sort of forgot or didn't manage to adhere, and then in that case it will be the rules around how quickly and what you're supposed to declare in terms of political donations. But as you say, if they suspect that actually this was done deliberately, that there was some way in which the Conservative Party was deliberately trying to get around the rules, then that could be something criminal, and then they would refer that to the police. They themselves would sort of hand it over at that point, and it would be up to the police to look at whether there was a case. But lots of these bodies don't have sanctions, or have sanctions which are quite difficult to apply. So we've seen ACABA, as you said, the business appointments body. There's been a lot of concern that it's too weak. It can't impose any sanction other than writing saying we're very disappointed in what you've done, or you haven't consulted us and we'd rather you didn't take that job. But there's nothing they can do to stop anyone taking a job. And the whole point of that body is to, avoid there being any possibility of conflicts of interest, but it really can't enforce that.
I mean, it can be, just to argue from the other side, that the police can be brought in, and people have been convicted and even gone to prison in connection with these sorts of issues, haven't they? That's
right. In relation to MPs' expenses, the former MP David Chater was found guilty just under normal fraud laws of fiddling his MPs' expenses, and he tried to argue that because he was an MP, the law shouldn't apply to him, but the courts didn't agree with that. And there were in 2017 some criminal prosecutions around the use of expenses. The use of money to support campaigns in certain constituencies which went over limits that were allowed. So no, the laws can be applied. But the question is whether there is sufficient deterrence, I think, from the sanctions that are available to make people really sit up and think these are important rules that we need to follow.
And do you think they are insufficient at the moment?
I think in some areas they really are. I think in relation to what appointments you can take up after leaving public office, we definitely need some form of sanction that could come there, because otherwise, we've seen instances, George Osborne, Boris Johnson take jobs after leaving ministerial office and not bother to consult the body. And I think that just shows that it's not seen as a serious consideration by people, and I think that's really unfortunate.
I mean, in the end, as we referred to earlier, I suppose the idea should be that people should understand what they really are allowed to do, not just in the letter, but also in the spirit of the way these systems work.
Well, that's it. The really desirable thing would be for everybody to reflect, everyone who's in public life, to reflect on the Nolan principles and to test everything that they do against those Nolan principles, of selflessness, honesty, all those things, to say, if I did this, would that be in line with this? But unfortunately, lots of people, they're busy. They, in some circumstances, having actual rules and sanctions can be more of an incentive and more of a kind of robust framework for making them consider those things than just a desirable, well, it would be nice if you would act in a principled way.
How would you say we compare to other countries? I'm conscious, for instance, that a former president of France, Nicolas Sarkozy, has been found guilty of trying to bribe a judge and has actually got a prison sentence hanging over him. It's suspended, and I'm sure he's appealing. But how do we compare?
Well, I think in many ways it is important to look at the big picture, because the problems that we have here look like small fry in comparison to the problems we see in many other countries. And lots of countries don't have regulation. I was looking recently at the sort of lobbying regulation, and I think more than half of OECD countries don't have any form of regulation around who can lobby whom. We also look at different political systems and how susceptible they are to sort of interference or sort of conflicts of interest. If you look at the US system, for example, lots of people who are in public office in the US have to stand for election, whereas we have sort of impartial civil service. People in the US are regularly needing to be re-elected, and to get re-elected into positions in the US, you have to have a lot of money. So that is just a big risk factor in the US. Although there's quite a lot of transparency in their system, there's also more risk. So I think that, in some ways we should say, our system is not necessarily, on the scale, having the same scale of problems as elsewhere. But, at the same time, trust in politicians and in Parliament in the UK is lower than in most other European countries and has declined dramatically. And I think we ought to be really concerned about that, because as we've seen in the context of the pandemic, it's really important for people to feel that they trust government. If government needs to ask them to do things like completely curtail their daily lives, take a vaccine, all these things that we've needed to do as a country in order to address the coronavirus pandemic. If people fundamentally don't trust government, then why should they follow those things when they're asked to?
And is a better system of regulating standards in public life part of the way to get back to building that trust then?
Well, I think it's one part of it. I think, there are lots of different ways in which politicians need to pay a lot more attention to this. I think, in my view, politicians tend to think, it's just a one-off, it's just a bad apple. The public aren't really concerned about it. They're not, this isn't what's driving people's concern about what's going on in politics. But I think it just chips away at public confidence in a way which is really undermining. And actually, if politicians wanted to do something very positive about it, that would have a positive effect on public trust. It's fair to say that, opposition parties are always much more keen on addressing these sorts of scandals while in opposition, and that curiously dissipates when they get into power. The Labour Party being very strong about it now. David Cameron was very strong about it before he had the opportunity to do something about it. And when he came into government, what he did in terms of addressing lobbying was much less strong than people might have anticipated. So, it's tricky. Once you're in government, it doesn't look like such an attractive prospect.
Is there one sort of specific practical policy that you would say, let's get this going, let's do this now, that you think would be a really good addition to the kind of framework that we have at the moment for standards in public life?
I'm a sort of maybe an idealist, and what I would really like to see is to stop making little changes and fiddling around the edges and addressing the last scandal. I would really like a more root and branch review of this, with the appetite for political will to put something new in place. But I'm probably also a realist, and that's not going to happen. So the one thing I think, if you were giving me the option right now, would be to make the independent advisor to the Prime Minister on the ministerial code able to initiate his own inquiries and to report on any inquiries to Parliament, so that there was no question. If there was something which was causing public concern, there was an independent person who was able to look into the facts and put the facts on the record. And we would get away from this difficult situation where, the Prime Minister is the arbiter of the ministerial code, which is important for constitutional reasons. Only the Prime Minister should be able to sack his own ministers. But it means that when you have a question relating to the Prime Minister, there is no way for the public to get a sort of an objective view of what went on inside government.
And that person has literally just been appointed, Christopher Geidt, Lord Geidt. We have the new man in place. And Labour are calling for exactly what you're calling for. Labour
are, and they've picked up basically on the call from the Committee on Standards in Public Life. The chair, Lord Evans, a couple of weeks ago made this recommendation that the advisor ought to have this independent power of initiation. They didn't go as far as I do in terms of the parliamentary link. But I think that, that Labour have picked up on that recommendation from a standards body. That's why the standards body is there, to feed policy ideas into the mix. And I think it's what's required to help rebuild public trust around this right now.
Any inclination, thought that the government might actually take up that idea right now?
Well, I think we know that they've decided not to, because in appointing Lord Geidt, they did tinker with his terms of reference, and they've given him the right to suggest to the Prime Minister that an inquiry should happen, but it's still up to the Prime Minister whether it does or not. And I think that was a very minor change. It's allowed them to be able to say, we've expanded his remit, but really not in any meaningful way. And I think that shows us that they've decided right now that they don't want to do that, because the moment to do it would be on making this new appointment. So I think that's quite disappointing.
So it doesn't augur well necessarily for the sort of changes you would hope to see? No,
it really doesn't. I mean, I think, in my view, it wouldn't have been. I think this would have been a real way to instill greater confidence. It wouldn't have, and if the government was really keen to dispel public concern in this area, it would have been something relatively simple they could have done, and they've chosen not to.
Okay, well, there you go. There's plenty more to be looked at and talked over on this. But Hannah White from the Institute for Government, thank you very much for talking to us for this edition of How Did We Get Here?
That's a pleasure.
Dr. Hannah White from the Institute for Government, still waiting for someone to really seize hold of this issue, assuming anyone wants to. If you have thoughts on this or ideas for any other podcasts, you can email me at andy.bell@itn.co.uk, and I'm tweeting it at andybell5news. And please share, rate and review. Thank you for listening to this edition of How Did We Get Here? There'll be another along soon.